Going to be looking at how arrays and objects work in this lesson. So how we can assign arrays and also how arrays are referencing the same memory data location content. There's also how you can get the array length, how you can update array content, output array content, some methods that are available for manipulating the content of the array, adding new items into the array, removing from the first and from the end of it. Also objects, and how you can assign values for objects using the bracket location and the dot notation in order to output the values that are contained within the object. JavaScript arrays allow us to hold multiple values that can be contained within one variable. So let's go ahead and we're going to create an array. So arrays are assigned using the square brackets. The content between the square brackets is going to be comma separated in order to indicate the items of the array. The array items can be various data types, so you can have strings, you can have numbers, booleans, you can also contain other arrays within arrays, and you can also contain objects within arrays. So let's go ahead and we're going to create our first array, output that into the console, and the way that the content is going to be output into the console is that they're all going to be based with the index value, and that's going to return back the value that's associated with that particular item in the array. So if we want to reference and return back the value of 5, then we would use the index value of 1. So to return back the values, you would use the square brackets and then the index value of the item that we want to return back. And we can see that when we use ARR with the square brackets on 1 for the index, that's going to return back the value of 5. So let's go ahead and we're going to select that and output that into the console. And just as we can select those values, we can reassign new values to those as well. So if we want to update and set the new value for that item with the index value of 1 to 100, that's going to update the value within the array. And we can open the array and we can see that now index value of 1 has a new value that's been assigned to it. You can also assign using the index value. So if the index value does not exist, you can assign a new value to it and the array will still be created. That's still a valid way, even though now there is a gap between the items that we have actually added values to and the empty items. And notice as well that the length property of the array will tell us how many items are contained within the array. And even though these ones are empty, going all the way up to the item with the index value of 50, that gives us a total of 51 items in the array, counting the first item with an index value of 0. So all of these empty items will be returning back a value of undefined, and the array will automatically fill in the gaps between those items, adding those values into the array as empty. The arrays come with the property value of length. This can also be used within the code in order to see how many items are currently within the array. So if we were to take the length of the initial array and then select the length of the array afterwards, we'd see that now it's changed because we've added in several additional items into the array. Arrays come with various methods to add content into the array, and these are useful in manipulating the contents of the array. So if we want to add to the end of the array, we would select the array, and using the push method, this would allow us to add an additional item into the array. So now it's going to add it to the end of the array. If I log out the result for the array, we see that we've added in an additional item at the end of the array. We can also remove the last item from the array, and that's using the pop method. So selecting pop will simply remove out whatever the last item of the array is. And now when we look at the array, once again, we're back down to 51 items because we've removed out the last item from the array. This also is going to return back a value, and that value then we can use within the code, and this is going to be whatever the value of the item is that was at the end of the array. So in this case, the value of val is going to be end, as we added it into the end of the array, and then the next line of code, val, we removed it and returned it back using the pop method. You can also add to the start of the array. So this one is ending to the end. If we want to add to the start of the array, we could use the array, identify the array, and then use the unshift method and select the value that we want to add to the start. So now it's going to be adding a new value to the start of the array. So now our array is going to have 52 items, and the value with the index value of 0 is going to be start. You can also remove the item from the start of the array. So you can do that, and I'll create another variable called val1, and this is going to be using the shift. And what shift is going to do is, just like we saw with the pop, it's going to select the first item, take it out of the array, and then return back the value within the variable. And then again, we can use that within the code as needed. Notice as well that we were using const, and we were also able to update the items of the array. And the reason for this is that the arrays are going to be based on a memory location. So this content here is just being stored within a memory location, and then JavaScript is accessing it and assigning the ARR variable to that location. So any updates to the content of that data is not going to be reflected. It's not going to be actually changing the variable, because it's still going to be pointing to the same location. And you can see that when we select ARR1, we assign it to ARR. So this is going to be assigning the memory location, not the data that's contained within there. And when we output the result for ARR1 into the console, after we've done all of the manipulation, the result is going to be the same. The values that are contained within ARR and ARR1 are going to be identical. So even any changes to ARR1 are going to also be reflected within ARRR. So let's select the ARR1 and the item with the index value of 10, and I'm going to update this to updated. And now that value is being reflected in both of those variables, as it's only pointing to the same location. And you got to keep this in mind when you are manipulating the array. These are not separate values. These are going to be pointing to the same location, and any update to one is going to be reflected in the other. There's also objects that allow us to store multiple values within the one variable. And much like arrays, they're going to work within the same way, where we can use const to assign the variable to the object information, and this data is going to be referenced. And if we assign one object to another object, those memory locations and those values are still going to all be connected. So within the object, this provides us a way to set multiple values. And the way that we assign the values, which is going to be different than the arrays, is in order to reference the value, we would use a property name. And this property name is going to be how we can return back the value that's assigned to it. So values within the object, different than the arrays, because they're going to be assigned to a name paired value to the values. So separating them and assigning the different values to them, and they just comma separate them just as you did with the arrays. And just like arrays, we can accept different data types. So there's some numbers, there's some strings, Boolean value, so including different arrays. So I'm going to set the array, and this is still going to be referencing that same memory location. So any changes of the array content within the object are also going to be reflected in ARR and ARR1. When you output the object into the console, it outputs it within a readable structured format. And these are all going to be, the order of the items in the array will be alphabetical. So the ARR is first, then we've got first, last, status, and ID. And it's a different order than what's being represented here. You can only use the name one time, so these are all going to be unique. If you do have a name, and then you also have the value of first being Lawrence, what happens is that the first instance of first is going to get overwritten with the last value that's being assigned to that property name, and that's why we can only see the one property name in there. So these are all going to be unique, as they do need to identify the values that are contained within them. In order to access, so if we did want to access this array, we can select the array, and using either the dot notation or the bracket notation to return back the result of the content of the object. So you can use either one. So typically when we have just a regular JavaScript object and these key names only just have the one word, then you can use the dot notation. So it can be returned back as first. Or you can use the bracket notation, which is going to be similar to what we saw with the arrays, where this is going to be returning back the string value of the property name. So outputting both of those values the same way. And this is also going to be more dynamic. So within the array, you can also have quotes for the property name. And this can't be returned back within the dot notation. For a case like this, you would have to use the bracket notation in order to return back that property by its name. So if you tried to use the dot notation, you wouldn't be able to, as it would throw an error. So you have to use the bracket notation in order to reference that property name, because it does contain a space, and that allows us to properly access that property and return back the value that's associated with it. Let's also select the array items that are contained within the object. So we've got the object, and then we have a property with the name of array. So let's do ARR to return back the array contents. So now we see that we're referencing that same array object that we had earlier. Let's make some changes to the array, and then we'll see how it gets reflected within the other arrays variables that we've also referenced that same array content to. And I'm going to just type in hello world as a string value. So now within the array, we've got the fourth item has an index value of hello world. If you type in the original array, so the ARR, then we also have the hello world, and as well the variable name of ARR1 is also going to have the hello world. And we create a second object and just assign it to be the same location as the object 1, and we make some changes to the contents of object 1 or object 2. It's going to also get reflected into object 1. And typically you wouldn't be reusing it and reassigning it, because it does lead to some confusion within the code. So stay to assigning the data to one array and try to avoid assigning that same array and other variable names.